Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're looking way past those chaotic daily headlines to uncover a hidden historical pattern. We're going to look at the specific cycle of foreign intervention that actually birthed the modern Iranian regime. Look, when we see news out of the Middle East, it can feel overwhelmingly complex, right? Almost impossible to parse. But if we take a step back and really trace the structure of history, things start to make a whole lot more sense. Today, we're diving into exactly how a legacy of fear, power, and foreign control shaped the nation we see today.
Now, contrasting our modern view of Iran with its actual deep history is the absolute key to understanding this whole story. On one hand, we've got this modern perception, right? A hostile religious regime with nuclear ambitions that is just constantly dominating our screens. But let's flip the script to reality for a second. For most of its history, Iran, or Persia, as outsiders called it, was a fiercely sovereign civilizational superpower. We're talking about a nation that ruled over massive swaths of the Middle East and Central Asia. Imagine being at the literal center of the world for over 2,000 years. Grasping this massive, painful shift from ancient superpower to modern regime requires us to go back to a very critical turning point.
So by the 1800s, this once dominant superpower was, well, in a bit of a decline, and it found itself completely squeezed in a bitter 19th century rivalry. Historians call this the Great Game. The expanding Russian Empire was aggressively pushing south, desperate to secure winter trade routes and warm water ports. Meanwhile, the British Empire, watching nervously, wanted to protect the high ground just east of Iran. They consider this territory the ultimate buffer to secure their absolute most valuable colony, India. Practically overnight, Iran became the ultimate geopolitical chessboard for these two expanding empires.
And man, this kicked off a vicious 150-year cycle of foreign meddling that just devastated the nation. In the 1800s, the ruling Iranian Shahs needed cash, so they essentially pawned off their country's infrastructure to the British and Russians in the form of monopolies. By 1890, they literally sold Britain a 50-year monopoly on all tobacco in the entire country. As you can guess, this sparked massive outrage among the public. In 1905, the Iranian people miraculously managed to form a democratic parliament to put a leash on the Shah's secret deals. But the response? Totally brutal. Russian troops and cannons rolled right in and crushed it. By World War I in 1914, despite officially declaring neutrality, Iran was completely ravaged by these fighting empires, plunging the nation into terrible economic ruin and mass starvation. The Iranian people's attempts at self-determination were just repeatedly suffocated from the outside. The British strategy here was, well, it was highly calculated. Their imperial stance was surprisingly direct. We do not want to occupy Iran, but we cannot see it occupied by our foes. You see, Iran was simply too massive, too spread out, and way too mountainous for Britain to conquer directly with boots on the ground. So instead, Britain used a strategy of quiet coercion. They controlled the nation from the outside by buying up its essential industries, its telegraph lines, its banks, its tolls, all strictly to keep the Russians at bay and maintain their own sphere of influence.
Then, a massive discovery completely escalated this exploitation. You guessed it: oil. In 1908, the British discovered vast reserves in Iran, right at the exact moment their global navy was switching from coal to oil power. Suddenly, Iran was the vital engine of British naval dominance. But the disparity in wealth extraction here was just staggering. Britain was pumping incredible riches out of the country to fuel an empire, seizing a massive 84% of all the profits. The Iranian people, the ones who actually owned the land beneath their feet and were doing the backbreaking labor, they were left with a mere 16%.
Naturally, the Iranian people were desperate for independence and modernization. Eventually, a strong military leader named Reza Shah took power. He aggressively built railways, opened universities, and really pushed for a modern, secular, and truly independent Iran. He even demanded the international community stop calling them Persia and use their actual historical name, Iran. But his ambitions met a really tragic historical irony. When World War II broke out, Reza Shah attempted to remain entirely neutral. But the British and the Soviets, they absolutely refused to lose control of the oil and those strategic transit routes. So they simply invaded, forced the Shah into exile, and installed his young 22-year-old son on the throne, mainly because a young king was far more willing to be compliant.
But after decades of this kind of foreign control, the Iranian people had built a culture of fierce political protest. They were completely fed up. Enter Mohammad Mossadegh. He was a wildly popular, democratically elected prime minister who absolutely refused to back down. He stood up to the British and demanded that Iran finally take full control of its own sovereign resources. In 1951, he championed the complete nationalization of the Iranian oil industry.
For a brief, shining moment, it genuinely looked like Iran was finally going to break that 150-year cycle of exploitation. But the empires, they absolutely refused to let go. Britain immediately boycotted Iranian oil and blockaded their vital ports to basically suffocate the economy. When Mossadegh wouldn't budge, the British convinced the American CIA that Mossadegh might be vulnerable to Soviet influence during the escalating Cold War. The result? $12 million. In today's money, that was the initial CIA budget quietly and swiftly allocated to secretly dismantle Mossadegh's democratic government and ensure that oil kept flowing to the West. Breaking down the anatomy of this 1953 coup is absolutely vital for understanding the modern Iranian mindset. It wasn't a military invasion, right? It was an internal sabotage. First, the CIA sneaked operatives in to bribe politicians and pay off newspapers to run fierce, entirely fabricated smear campaigns against the prime minister. Next, they funded and organized chaotic mobs in the streets to create this terrifying illusion of a nation actively collapsing into anarchy. Finally, the ultimate defining move. They manipulated and flipped enough of the Iranian military to physically go to the prime minister's house, arrest their own democratic leader, and sentence him to life under house arrest. The tragic result? It was swift and severe. The young pro-Western Shah, yeah, the very same one originally installed by the British during World War II, flew back into the country and was essentially handed absolute power by the Americans. Now, he did modernize the country in a heavily Western direction, for sure, but he did it with an absolute iron fist. He eliminated all political opposition and, with direct assistance from the CIA, created a brutal secret police force to capture, torture, and spy on anyone who dared oppose his rule. The oil kept flowing out to the West, but domestic resentment within Iran was rapidly boiling over. When you actually know this deeply painful history, the fiery rhetoric of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini makes perfect sense, doesn't it? He passionately argued, the government has sold our independence. All of our miseries are caused by those imperialists. Khomeini was a strict religious cleric, but his messaging wasn't just theology. It was deeply anchored in what the public viewed as a century of entirely justified anti-imperialist rage. He expertly tapped into a profound historical trauma that resonated across the entire nation, regardless of a person's religious beliefs. So when the breaking point finally hit in 1979, it wasn't just a religious movement. It was a massive, highly diverse coalition. Working-class shop owners, university students, secular intellectuals, striking oil workers, and conservative clerics all marched together in the streets. They definitely didn't agree on what Iran's future should look like, but 40 million people were fiercely united by one shared overarching goal: throwing out the Western-backed Shah and ending foreign puppet rule once and for all. And through sheer overwhelming will, they actually succeeded. Section 1. The coup-proof architecture. Breaking the cycle. Once Khomeini and his closest followers seized control of the post-revolution government, they looked back at 150 years of their country being systematically dismantled by outsiders, and they decided to build a highly specific, highly paranoid regime to ensure no foreign power could ever topple them again. Experts call this a filtered democracy. Democratic elements technically exist, the public votes, they elect a parliament, they elect a president, but every single one of those elements is entirely subordinate to an absolute religious filter. Elected bodies answer to appointed religious councils, who ultimately answer to the supreme leader. It is purposely designed to give the illusion of participation while making it structurally impossible for a movement from below to ever vote the regime out of power. And, to prevent another CIA-style military flip, like the one that took down Mossadegh in 1953, they built a dual military system. Iran has a standard conventional military tasked with protecting national borders and deterring invasions. But parallel to that, they created an entirely separate fighting force, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. The IRGC has its own army, its own navy, and its own air force, and its sole constitutional purpose is regime survival. They control local militias, specifically to crush internal protests, and they fund vast proxy networks to project power all across the Middle East. Understanding this deep-seated, historical fear of foreign overthrow reveals exactly why they pursue nuclear capabilities. For the last 40 years, this paranoid regime has watched its global rivals and decided that the ultimate survival tool is a nuclear deterrent. In their eyes, building that capability is the only permanent, guaranteed way to stop the centuries-long cycle of outside intervention from the West, Israel, and neighboring states. But hey, we absolutely must separate the regime from the everyday citizens of Iran. According to some polling, up to 80% of modern Iranians do not actually support this oppressive government. That's a massive majority.
Despite multiple waves of courageous mass protest over the decades, the regime's coup-proof architecture has managed to survive every single time, often at a terrible, terrible cost to the public.
I'm going to leave you with this final thought. After centuries of being utilized as a geopolitical chessboard, how long will the brilliant, resilient people of Iran remain trapped? They're caught right in the middle, between a high-control, paranoid regime at home and the outside powers who have spent 2 centuries trying to dictate their destiny. When will the Iranian people finally have the chance to chart their own uncompromised future? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history behind the headlines.